Hey guys. Um, yeah, so what happened was the workshop from Thursday morning, which was January 11th, wasn't recorded properly because of Zoom glitching somehow. So this is a re-recording of um, the second half of workshop 3, and we'll be going through steps 5 through 10, um, picking up from where Tony left off of on Wednesday. So just a quick recap of the first part of workshop 3. We first went through step 0, which was replacing the profile with the feed component. Um, and I'm actually going to open up the code uh, right now. If you guys can follow along here, that'd be great too. So if you haven't already, run git reset hard. And then let's check out W3 step 5 just to see like all the completed steps from yesterday. Since this is a recording, I'll just assume that you can like pause the video and then follow along on your own. Yeah, so step 0 was replacing the profile with the feed component. Um, if you haven't already, run npm run hotloader so that in localhost 5050 you can see Kappa React. So this is the feed page. And then in step 1, we used use state, which is a hook in React, to store all of the stories. This should say story. And then we used a get request to request all the stories from the database. And then in step 2, we implemented the single story component, or I guess we rendered it, and then we just used some dummy data. And in step 3, we continued off of that to map the actual story data that we got from the request into these single story components. And then in step 4, finally, we used the new post input component to create a new story component that we can see here, that lets us post new stories or send a post request, and then these new stories can show up at the bottom of this feed. Yeah, so that's a bit of a recap of workshop 3, or at least the parts so far. And today we're going to be continuing first off by adding navigation. Um, yeah, so make sure you've done git reset hard, and then you've done git checkout W3 step 5. So we're adding two pages here, the home page and the profile page. Um, and we're adding like these links to the top of the nav bar. So how exactly do we do app navigation? Well, right now we have our app and then a nav bar, and our desired functionality is we either render the feed, the profile, or a not found page. And this is determined via a concept called routing. So routing sort of like chooses which component you want to render, um, based on the URL that you're currently at, or like the path that you're currently at. Um, so specifically, like if you have a URL, um, you have your base URL and the route path. So this URL consists of the base URL, which is capbook.com, and then the route path is sort of like nothing here, but it's actually the same thing as the second URL, which is capbook.com with the forward slash. Um, the forward slash is, for our purposes, we'll just assume they're sort of like the same thing. We can ignore any like trailing forward slashes. In this case, the base URL is again capbook.com, and the path is profile, and then this path is ASDF. So I'll show exactly what we mean by wanting to render feed profile and not found based on the URL. But first, let's talk about what exactly routing is. So for routing, we're going to be using a library called Reach Router, which is sort of similar to uh, another library in React called React Router. And you can learn more about Reach Router here. Um, and more recently, Reach Router has sort of been like merged into React Router. So if you're like, I guess, building something more complicated, maybe you want to use React Router. But like I think Reach Router is like more simple to learn. It's a bit easier to use for like a simpler website. So we'll be showing how we can use Reach Router, and we'll also be using Reach Router in this workshop. Um, yeah, so there's two components that we're going to be using from the Reach Router library. One is router and one is link. So first off, what does a router component do? The router takes a URL from the address bar. We feed that into the router component, and then we either render um, one component based on the URL, or render a different component, or render a different component. And somehow this router determines, like, based on this URL, which components to render. And notice that, like, these are sort of not, or these are not rendered all at once. Either A is rendered, or B is rendered, or C is rendered. So here's an example of a router being used. Suppose that we're like inside of the app, this app component, and we put a router here that has three children components. One is the home component, one is the dashboard, one is the team. And each of these has a props called path. And this path is a string that's different in each case. So for home, we have this / string. For dashboard, we have the word dashboard. And for team, we have / then team. So what's important to know is that all of these are paths, but they're a bit different. So the second one in dashboard is a relative path because we have no leading slash. So relative path means that we append like whatever is inside the string to the end of your URL or your current path. So let's say that we were inside this URL, google.com/maps. Um, Now the relative path, uh, or this path, I guess, refers to this URL because relative to google.com/maps, um, dashboard, or like if we use the path relative, then relative is going to like be at the end of this. So we're pretty much keeping our current path and then adding whatever our relative path is. Alternatively, an absolute path is called a lead or is called an absolute path because you always go to the root path and then add whatever the absolute path is. And this is characterized by a leading slash in the front. So suppose that like google.com is the root path, then this path refers to google.com / absolute, no matter what my path currently is, because this / puts you at the root, which is at google.com. And this is a special type of root path, or sorry, absolute path, which is the root path. And this is just a /. And the reason it's special is because this is the entry point of your website. So like if I looked at a URL like google.com, then this is like the entry point. What's rendered is really like google.com with the /. So that's where you enter your website. Same with like localhost 5050. If I just go to localhost 5050, that's like the entry point. And that path is characterized by this / only. So yeah, this is like the root of the application. So that's why like absolute paths will go to the root of the application because they start with this /. So this might make sense with like some examples. If I'm at the URL sports.com, I'm just going to turn this off. So if I'm at the URL sports.com, assuming that our base URL is sports.com, then this is essentially saying that we're at um, the path forward slash. So our router is going to see the URL sports.com and it's going to default to this forward slash and it's going to render app and then it's going to choose to render home like so. Now, if the URL is like sports.com forward slash dashboard, then it chooses instead this path of dashboard and then it renders the dashboard component. And then path equals team. This URL or this path, since it's in the root, would correspond to this URL. So if I'm at the URL sports.com forward slash team, then it's going to choose to render app and then team inside the router. So this might be a bit confusing because like these sort of do the same thing, this dashboard and the team, except here dashboard is like a relative path and then forward slash team is an absolute path. But in this case, since we're already in the root path, it's going to do the same thing because relative to the root, uh, if I append dashboard, it's just going to be like forward slash dashboard. And since this is absolute, this is just forward slash team. So I could get rid of this forward slash in front of team, or I could add a forward slash to this dashboard and it would do the same thing. So this is a slide just showing some of the properties of like nested paths or nested routes. And this can get pretty hard. So I'm going to skip over this for now. But if you're interested in learning more about it, I really recommend just watching a YouTube video or reading the documentation inside Reach Router to learn more about like how these nesting routes work. Some cool things that you can do with routes in the end is like you can pass in like some value inside the URL. And then this is sort of treated like an argument that you can pass in as props to this profile component. So like if I was at the URL forward slash team forward slash 123 here, then it would actually render root, then team, and then pass in user ID equals whatever this string is, 123, because I tell it to using this syntax. But this is sort of advanced, and I recommend doing this maybe later on, since for now, our use of net routes isn't too complicated. We don't really need to use any of this for our Capbook React workshop. So what we want Capbook to look like after step 5 is this. We want our homepage to be feed. So if we're at localhost 5050, we want our homepage to show the nav bar and then the feed. And then if we're at the route forward slash profile, then we want to show this profile component that we created from workshop 2. And then if we're at localhost 5050, we want something like a default so that like if I put anything after here, like localhost 5050 ASDF or localhost 5050 anything else, then this not found component shows, indicating to the user that you're in a place that you shouldn't be. So notice that all of these pages have the navbar component. And this tells us that we probably don't want to put the navbar component inside the router. We'll put it outside so that the router only chooses like which of the components in the bottom to render. We don't want the router to, or I guess like the router is not choosing to render the navbar every time. So this one's feed, that one's profile, and then this one is the not found component. And to uh, put concretely like what I meant by putting the nav bar outside the router, inside our app component, what we probably want to do is have the app and then have the nav bar inside the app component, and then have a router that either chooses to render feed, profile, or not found. And the way we choose which components render is we use this path. And the path for feed is going to be / because this is like our landing page or our home. And then for profile, we want the path to be profile because this refers to whatever base URL is. So localhost 5050 and then / profile. And then this keyword default, we didn't talk about really, but um, that just means that like if we find a path that doesn't match anything else, then by default, this not found component will be rendered. So this is what it looks like at each path. And just to show you like what this would look like at the end, let me check out step 5, or sorry, step 6. And if I press on home, I'm taken to localhost 5050, just the root. If I put a / here, if I put a / and then enter, it's the same thing. But if I have / and then profile, I want to go to this profile page, or I want this profile page to be rendered. And then if I go to some other thing, then I want this not found component to be rendered. So that's or that's like the end of step 5, and we'll be implementing that. And the other part of routing is we want these link components that can take us to certain URLs. So this is, again, using a relative path, and then this is using an absolute path. And this 2 is a prop that's passed down to link that tells you which path to go to if you click this link. And it kind of looks like this if you just render it. This is like the link component UI. So let's say that we're currently at localhost 5050 / profile. If I click this link, if I click this link component, then it's going to take me to localhost 5050 / profile / new page, because this is relative. So I just append it to like the end, where I start off like here and then I add new page. And then if I use this absolute link instead, then I go to / or sorry, localhost 5050 and / new page, because the root is not profile, but just localhost 5050 / So I add new page to the end of the root path. So let's follow along in step 5. In this step, we're going to be first implementing the router inside app.js so that it renders either the feed, the profile, or the not found component. And then navbar, we're going to be adding those links so that we can choose or go to different pages. So let's first open up app.js. Um, let me get reset hard, and then check out W3 step 5. So if you're here, our first step is going to be importing router. And I'm going to be doing this from reach router. Then I'm going to import the not found component. And this is, we're currently in app, so this is going to be inside the pages folder. And then inside not found.js. So we added these import statements. And now inside this app container div, I'm going to get rid of that. And then we're going to use the router here to either render feed, the profile, or the not found component. Okay. Now I want to render feed if, again, the path is just /. I want to render profile if the path is / profile, or if the relative path is profile, it's the same thing. And then I want to render not found if neither of those paths are satisfied. So if I save and then go to localhost 5050, let's see if this works. So if I go to the URL localhost 5050 / profile, then this profile page is rendered, which is great. And if I go to anything else, this not found component is rendered. And then at the default, at the URL localhost 5050, the feed is simply rendered. Okay, so we have the router implemented. And now let's go into navbar and add links to all these pages. So first, at the top, let's import link from reach router. And then we can use this link for home, as well as a link for profile. Now, I need to pass in these props. For home, I want to go to /, which is the root, and this will take me to pretty much localhost 5050. And then for profile, I want to go to profile, or I could do / profile. So if I save this, and then go back to here, I should see two links, one for profile and one for home. And now if I press profile, I go to this URL, which is what I want. And then if I press home again, this goes back to the home. So to get the final presentation that we want of the nav bar, we want these links to look a bit nicer and also to fall to the right of Capbook. So we can do this by first adding a div around these two links. I think prettier is not enabled for me, so I'm going to turn that on real quick. And then we can take a look inside navbar.css to see some of the classes that are given to us. So for the container that contains the links, we can use this navbar link container class. So we give it class name and then equals navbar link container. And then for each of these links, we can also give it some styling. And we can use the navbar dash link class. So all I did here was just add some styling to this div, or yeah, that div, as well as each of these links. And you can take a look at like what each of these classes does on your own time. Now, if I refresh, I see pretty much what I want to see. These links look better, but I want I want this container to go to the right of Catbook. I want them to be all in one line. And the way I do this is by using the CSS property inline block. Sorry, not inline block, inline or display inline. And if I go into utilities to find maybe a utility class that can help me do that, or yeah, sorry, it is inline block. I see this u dash inline block class, which just has this one property. And I can use this anywhere inside of my components because this is outside of the components folder. So I'm going to go back to app and then use, oh, sorry, not app, navbar. And then inside of both this div and the div below, I'm going to give it the u dash inline block styling. So if I go back here, now these two divs are in the same line because of the styling, and so it looks more normal. So that should be the end of step 5. All of these, again, URLs go to something different, and the router is able to choose which components to render. And then link at the top in the navbar can choose or like direct us to a different URL. So a quick overview of steps 6 through 8. In steps 1 through 4, we implemented feed.js, which consists of lots of single stories. Now in card.js, or in steps 6 through 8, we're working on card.js, but in a very similar manner. Similarly to how we had to request these stories from an API endpoint and then render them, we're going to have to request these comments using a GET request to an API endpoint and then render them inside of card.js. So previously, to request stories, we used this GET request to this API endpoint /API/stories. And this returned all the stories. And we had to give it no parameters. For posting a story, we used /API/story. And we had to give in the content of what our story that we want to be, or we wanted to give the content of the story that we wanted to have posted inside as a parameter to this post request. So now everything's very similar. It's sort of analogous, except we're using the /API/comment API endpoint to return all the store or all the comments for some particular story. And we have to pass in a parameter for this GET request, which is the parent, pretty much like the ID of the story, which is a string. And the reason we need this is because these comments are specific to a given story. So we can't just like request API comment without telling it which story these comments are part of. So the parameters go from having nothing to having this parent, which is an ID in the form of a string. And then same with the post request. Along with the content, I also need this parent parameter. So let's figure out how to obtain these comments first in step 6. Let's get reset hard and then check out W3 step 6. So our first step is to add these comments. We can do it just as a string inside of this container that's called card. So previously we had this feed component, and inside feed we had all of these single stories that were just rendered one by one. And now that we have comments, instead of doing like feed or with like single story, then comment, single story, comment, we're going to have feed consists of many components called cards. And then each card is going to contain a single story as well as a comments block. So first we're going to implement feed using this card instead of using single story. And then we're going to get the comments inside card. And then we're going to render them like stories. So first, inside of feed.js, instead of using single story, I want to use card, again, from that component hierarchy. So I'll import card. And then card is inside of modules. And then instead of single story, I'll be passing in, or I'll be rendering the card component. Okay, so now we have to define or implement this card component inside card.js. So in card.js, first, we can implement single story because the card is going to contain these single stories. And then we go down here. There's a few things that single story needs to know. So remember that the single story looks like this, where we have the creator name and then the content. However, this is given to us or it's stored inside of our feed. Inside our feed, we have the state stories that contains all of the story objects. And each of these story objects contains an attribute called creator name as well as content. So this is passed down as props into card. And for us to use it inside single story, we have to pass it down as props into single story. So first off, we know that card is given props. And these props, as we see inside feed.js, are called creator name and content. So if we go back into card.js, this div is going to contain a single story. And then we also need to pass in props that we use inside single story.js. So as we saw before, single story takes in creator name as well as content inside of the props. And that's how it renders the, or that's how it knows like um, what to display. So that means that whenever we create a single story component, we need to pass in creator name to something and then content. And we know from earlier inside feed that this is actually passed in as props into card. And these props happen to have the same name, props.creator name, and then props.content. So let's save this and see what it looks like before we move on. So if I save, everything looks the same. And that's because we haven't really added any components to render. All we've done is we have um, each of these single stories inside of this imaginary component called a card. And then the feed is rendering lots of these cards for each story. So it's going to look the same. But now if we add something to card, like let's say we add hi to this card, then each card is going to have a single story and then underneath it, this header hi. Or sorry, this heading hi. So we don't want that just yet. Um, Now the next step is to define a state to hold these comments that we see in this diagram. And we get them in a similar way to how we got these stories inside feed.js. First, let's create a state called comments. And we need it to have a setter function. We can call it set comments. And we use the use state hook. And we can initialize comments to an empty list. Make sure that when you use state, you import it from React at the top. Now, this use effects will take place when the card component is rendered upon mount. And I'm going to use a get request to request for the comments and then set it into this state. So the format of the get request I can sort of steal from feed.js. I'm actually going to copy the inside of this use effect. So I'll be getting or sending a get request from a certain endpoint. And this endpoint for us is API comments, as we see here. Now the difference here is that we have to pass in parameters as well. And these params can be, I don't need to specify that. These params is going to be this JavaScript object, and it's going to contain the key parent as well as the value, which we want to be the ID of this story. So this means that like when we're rendering this card component, um, when we have this story object that corresponds to the card, we also have to give the card component the ID of the story. So that way, when we're requesting for the comments, we can use that ID to ask the API, hey, give me all the comments related to this story. So I'm going to pass in props called ID. And this is going to have the value story object dot ID. And this is just like an attribute or a key inside of story object, which contains the ID. Now if I save that, And then inside here, I pass in the ID as a parameter. Then once I get the comment list or comments list, I can set my comments to be whatever I just got from that get request comments list. So remember, this get request is a function that returns a promise. And once it resolves, we're going to use the dot then. So once it resolves, it's going to call this callback function inside of dot then. And it's going to take whatever this promise resolved to, so comments list, and then set the state comments to comments list. Okay, let me save that. And then finally, let's see if this works by simply trying to display what this state looks like, comments. And since comments is a list, one way that we can just sort of stringify it or convert it to a string for us to view is to use the json.stringify function and then pass in this list. Okay, if I save that and then go back here, we see that the card component consists of a single story and then the comments list. And this happens for each card. Each card has a single story and a comments list. Cool. So that should be the end of step 6. We can add a bit of CSS to the outside of the card. I guess it's not too important, but we could go inside this div and then give it the class. If I go into class card.css, we could give it the class card container to give it a bit of styling. So now it looks more like what we saw in the image. Yeah, so that should be the end of step 5 or step 6. And now we're going to be styling these comments in step 7. So run get reset hard and then git checkout w3 step 7. Okay. Pretty much everything should be the same as what we did. But here inside single story, we're actually passing in the ID into this single story, even though we don't really need it. Again, we don't need it because the single story component only renders the name and then the content, as we see over here. So step 7 is going to be styling comments, where we take each individual comment and then convert it to this component that consists of the creator name and the content, separated by this divider. So we'll do this inside single comment.js first to implement each one of these components. And then we're going to use a single comment inside of card.js and map each comment inside card.js, or each comment inside an individual card to a single comment. Similarly to how we did inside feed.js for the cards. If that didn't make sense, I'll explain it in a bit. So first, let's go to single comment. So our desired format for the single comment is going to be creator name and then content. So these have to be passed in as props to single comment. And I'm going to use span. You can use any sort of, I guess, like element like header or paragraph. I'm going to use span, and then this is going to have the value props.creatorName. And then I'll make another span that contains the content. So since this is a string, I'm also going to add a divider or add another string uh, to props.content to act as the sort of divider. And remember, span is an inline element, which means that there's no new line at the end. So this span is going to be rendered, and then this span is going to be rendered right after it in the same line. Well, there's a bit more styling that we can do, but for now, to see what this would actually look like if we rendered a single comment, let's go to card.js. And then here, instead of simply printing or rendering the string version of these comments, we want to render something that's a lot more aesthetic. So for inspiration, we can go to feed first to see how we rendered those stories. So we define this variable called stories list and set it to null originally. Then we have this variable has stories that tells us whether or not we have any stories inside of our state. So it's true if we have stories, it's false if we don't. And then if we do have stories, then we define or we assign this value to stories list. And this value is essentially we're taking stories, which is the list of stories, and then mapping each of those stories to a different card component. So if I have like 5 stories inside of stories, then um, this function takes each of those stories and then returns a list of 5 cards, pretty much. And each of these cards is, again, as we saw before, passed in these props, ID, creator name, and content. And then otherwise, if we don't have any stories, then we simply just render this div that tells us, or that has the text no stories. And we assign that to stories list. And at the very end, we render whatever stories list is. So I'm going to copy and paste this into a card. So I'll copy that and then paste it here. And then I'll control F for stories and replace that with comments, or replace each occurrence of stories with comments. Comments. Okay. And then this should be comments list. So this is doing the same thing. If we have, or we initially set comments list to null, and then has comments will tell us whether or not we have any comments. Now, if we do have comments, then we're going to render, or we're going to map each comment to an individual single comments component. So we should take a comments object and then pass in the comment object's ID, comment object's creator name, as well as the comment object's content as props into this single comment. So if I do this and then take a look at single comment, to verify that these props names are correct, we should be good because we're passing in creator name and content into single comment when we use it inside card. Cool. So now comments list has what we want to render. And inside of this div, we can open the JavaScript environment and then put comments list here. So I'll save that and then take a look at what, oh yeah, we have to import single comment inside card.js. Cool. So now each comment, instead of like rendering all of the comments in a huge string, now we take each comment and then render it or map it to a single component, which renders the creator name and content like so. And I can apply some styling to the text inside of single comment. Um, yeah, so we'll be using story or card dash story content for, oh, sorry, that might not be correct. Oh, the CSS should be card dash comment body. So I can do card dash comment body. Oh, it's already here. I guess all the CSS that we're missing is maybe just bolding the creator name. And I can just give it the class u dash bold. And u dash bold is defined inside of our utilities.css file. Cool. So now it takes each of those spans and makes them bold. So that's the end of step 7. Um, and then step 8 finally is going to be implementing new comments. So we see that in our Catbook, we have this new story, which has an input box and then a submit button, which sends a post request to the API / API story. Sorry, I'll go back a slide. And we want to do something really similar, but we want to be able to post comments instead of stories. So each card should have this new comments block, which we define inside of new input.js. Or is it new post input.js? And this should send a post request to / API / comment. Cool. So first, we're going to implement new comment inside of new post input.js. And then we're going to just tack on new comment to the end of card.js so that each card has the new comment component. So inside of new post input.js, you can scroll down to where we define new comment. And then this is an exercise, so I'll let you guys have some time to try this out. As a hint, it's going to be very similar to new story. but we're going to be doing this for comments, so it's going to be a different post request. And then once you're done with that, add the new comment component to the bottom of card.js. So since this is a recording, I'll just go ahead and do it. If you haven't already, pause and try it out. And then once you're done, unpause. I'm going to copy over this new or add story function because it's code that like looks pretty similar to what we'll have. So basically, and I'll also copy over this code. Basically, the new comment component is going to consist of this new input or new post input component. And new post input has these two props, default text and on submit. And default text is the default text that renders inside of the text box in like sort of a gray color. And this should say new comment. And then on submit is the function that's called whenever I press that submit button. And I want add comments to be called. So now, like finishing this add comment function, we're passing in this variable body as the parameter. First, let me change the API endpoint to /API/comment instead of story. And then now, looking back at what parameters need to be passed in, we need the parent, which is the ID of the parent story, as well as the content that's being passed in. The content is essentially whatever you type into this comment box. So value is already passed in as our content. And we also need to pass in the parent as a parameter. And the parent should be passed in into our props for new comment somehow. Because remember, new comment is inside of the card component. And we know that inside the card component, we have the story's ID. So inside of the card component, we can pass in the ID into the new comment component. And then we can use that props inside of this post request. So with this in mind, if we know that we're being passed in _ID as a prop into new comment, then whenever we render the new comment component inside of card, we have to pass in this prop. So inside of card, first let's import new comments. Also, I just realized that I forgot to git reset hard and could check out W3 step 8. So if you guys haven't already, maybe do that first. Or actually, if you already worked on new post input, maybe copy and paste this entire thing so that you don't lose your work. Or if you had it already, if you already had step 7 working, then you can just continue. But apologies for forgetting to check out step 8. Yeah, so going back to card, we import new comments. And then at the bottom here, underneath the comments list, we can render the new comment component. And we need to pass in _ID as a prop. And this is actually given to us as a prop to the card component itself, as we saw earlier. And that prop is also called _ID. So we're using the same ID that we sort of passed into single story It's the same ID that we use to get the comments. This is the um, function that we implemented inside of step 6. And yeah, so we passed in the underscore ID prop inside card inside of feed.js. And then now inside of card.js, we're passing in underscore ID again um, into the new comment component. Now, if I save this, I also need to save this file. Um, okay, cool. Yeah, so now the card component consists of a single story, the comments list, and then the new comment component. And now if I type something and then want to post it as a comment, if I press submit and then refresh the page, I can see my comment at the bottom of this list. So that's the end of step 8. To recap, we implemented a new comment inside new post input.js and then added that component, or sorry, that added that component to card.js. Okay, now let's clean up our code a bit in step 9. So first, git reset hard, and then git checkout w3 step 9. Just one small note. Um, the code in W3 step 9 uses props.storyid. This essentially does the same thing. Um, maybe that was like better to do because we inside of our code or inside of our comment here, we specified that the props would be story ID. But we're essentially still passed down the story ID from the card component. So we're just calling it a different name. But it still functions the same way. Okay. So currently our component hierarchy looks something like this. We have almost everything implemented, and we're working in card right now inside the comment section. And the way card is, the children of card are, or sorry, not the children, but um, what's rendered inside of card is the single story, the single comment, and then the new comments. Or I guess this is like a comments list. And the problem here is we sort of want the single comments and the new comment to be in the same component so that it's a bit neater. Um, and that way, like if we wanted to pass down something from card into the comments, we could pass it down into the some like intermediate component, and then that component maybe like affects both the single comment and the new comment, um, but not the single story. So more concretely, um, we're gonna abstract the single comments and the new comment into this comments block. And then card is going to render single story and comments block, and comments block renders single comments and new comments. So in our website, nothing would actually change visually. All that would happen is um, inside of our code, um, this would go from like 3 separate parts conceptually. It'd go from this part, and this input part to 2 parts. It would go from, or it would become like this single story and then this entire comments block. And then the comments block contains these single comments and this new comment box. So we first start off by looking at card.js. I'm going to control X this and get rid of it. for now, but we're going to add the comments block component. Now let's go to commentsblock.js to implement it. And inside of comments block, I need single comment as well as new comment. Now, in my rendering, I'm going to return a div that contains the comments list as well as the new comments. Now this comments list hasn't been defined. So we need to go back here, see where comments list is. I'm going to control X this. So cut, and then go back to comments block, and then define what comments list is. So this is where we use single comment and new comment, which is why we had to import it. So now, one thing that we see is we're actually passed in, or we want to pass in the comments, not the comments list as a prop. And then we also pass in the story object. So I guess the story is actually the ID. But the important part is we're not actually going to be passing in this comments list as a prop. We're going to be passing in the comments itself. So that way, inside card.js, I can simply create a comments block section and then pass in as props comments, and also pass in, I guess I'll call it story, which is the props.id. To be more clear, I'll just use story ID. So now going back to comments block to implement it, we're passed in props. One's called comments, one's called story ID. And then we now need to define comments list using props.comments. So here we're still referencing comments like it was a state. We're actually passing comments into the props. So we need to use props.comments. Cool. Now, if I save this, as long as the page didn't change, that's good because it shouldn't be changing. To recap, inside card, we combined the comments list and the new comments input box into this comments block. And this comments block renders the comments list and the new comment component. And we're able to render it by passing in the comments and the story ID. Okay. Oh, just to verify that like this is in fact the correct. Yeah. So since we're calling it story ID, we passed in story ID equals something. We do need to change the name of this to story ID. Okay, so that should be the end of step 9. This is after you apply some CSS to it. It's not too important, but I'll just go through this kind of quickly without explaining too much. But basically, you can just, inside of the comments block, this div, we can apply some styling. which is found inside of card.css if you want to look at it. And then I can apply some more. Actually, for the sake of time, I'm just going to check out step 10 and then sort of explain what styling was done. Yeah, so we just put like um, this class, or we applied this class card dash comment section to the outside div, and then applied story comments to each of these. The new comments should actually be outside of that div, but that's okay. And then everything else is the same. We still have essentially our comments list as well as the new comments component. The only difference here is that they took whatever we define comments list to be and put it directly in here. So just like save some code, but you don't really have to do that if you don't want to. If it makes more sense for you, you can like define the comments list out here and then put in comments list into those curly braces. Okay. So step 10 is going to be rendering on submit. Now, one of the problems we have currently is that if I create a new story and then submit, if I go down all the way to the end of the feed, I'm not going to see the story that I just submitted. I have to refresh the page in order to see it. So this is, I guess, like, okay, but it'd be a lot nicer if I could see the story right after I click submit. So one way you can do this is by passing in an add new story, um, an add new story function from feed.js all the way down to the new story component. And uh, this might not make sense right now, but we'll be coding it out. Conceptually, the story should render inside of feed.js once you click submit. And you're essentially like adding a new story to the uh, state stories so that if the stories is changed, since it's a state, React is going to re-render this entire thing. So it's going to recreate the new stories or the stories list. And when it recreates it, it's going to include that new story that you add into the stories list. So inside of here, we want a new function called const add new story. And this is going to be a callback function. Now, it's going to take in a story object. And the story object is going to be like the new story that you just submitted. And what we want to happen is we want to set our stories to be our old stories plus this story object's appended to the end. So it's going to look like stories, which is a list, dot concat, which adds a list to the end of it. And this list that we want to add to the end is just going to be a single element list that contains story object. So for example, if I had like story one, story two, if this was my value of stories currently, and then I call set stories, or if I pretty much do this. If I call set stories, I set it to stories.concat this array containing story 3, then once this promise is fulfilled, since this is an async function, stories is going to become story 1, story 2, and then story 3. So this is all we need for add new story. But the problem is add new story isn't called inside of feed, right? Add new story is called whenever I press the submit button. And the submit button is located inside of the new story component. So we have to find a way to pass this add new story function into this new story component. And we can actually pass in this function as a prop into new story. So I can create a new prop called add new story and pass in this function that we defined. And then now inside of new story, which is inside of new post input.js, up here, we're given some props. And what we want to happen is once we post the story, then we want to do something. Then we want to take whatever we're given and then call this add new story on this element. So I didn't explain that really well just now. What I mean is post API story is going to send a post request to this endpoint. And this returns a promise to do essentially that. And once this promise resolves, and once like pretty much once it's fulfilled, so once like the story is actually posted in the server or in the backend, then I'm going to take whatever this promise resolves to. In this case, it's not actually given to us, but suppose that we know that we're given like the new story that we just posted as the response. So then we take the response, which is that new story, and then we call the add new story function with this new story that we're given. Now this add new story function was actually passed in as a prop into new story from card.js, from the card component. Oh, sorry, not card, feed, from the feed component. So now, pretty much once this promise is resolved, we call this callback function, which calls this function, add new story with story object. And what that does is it takes that story object and then concatenates it to stories and sets stories to that new list with story objects concatenated at the end. Okay, so let me save that file and then test this out. So now if I go back to Kephook React, and then let's say I make a new story. And then press submit. If I go to the bottom of the page, I see that this story is rendered immediately without me having to refresh the page. I guess more technically, this story wasn't rendered immediately. it was rendered as soon as that post request um, promise resolved, and then the add new story function was called. Okay, so that's how you do it for stories, and then doing it for comments is very similar. We can create an add new comment function and then pass it down to a comments block, and then pass it down to new comment, and then call it uh, after we post a new comment. That's going to be homework, I guess, if you want to try it out. And you can check out the code inside W3 Complete. But yeah, that should be it for the workshop. There's a lot of content in this, and it's pretty difficult. So feel free to go to office hours if you have any questions about any concepts in here, and any of the staff would be more than happy to help you out. Yeah, that should be it. Sorry for the late release of this recording because Zoom was glitchy. But yeah, thank you so much.